Greetings and salutations, fellow book readers. This is Mark, and the book I will review today is Great Expectations. Before we continue, this is personalized limited edition of Great Expectations with leather cover designed and made by me. At the end of the video, I will tell you a couple of ways of how you can get one for yourself if you are interested. Now let's get back to the review. Great Expectations is one of the last novels written by Charles Dickens and published in 1861. Dickens was the undisputed king of the Victorian literature. Many of his novels, such as A Christmas Carol and Oliver Twist, focus on the plight and suffering of children in 19th century England. And many of his novels also criticize capitalism, which is not a surprise considering its brutal treatment and impact on children. Dickens' books enjoy constant popularity and have been adapted into various media, but I myself am not really a Dickens fan. I find his writings a bit too commercial and written above all for the reader, similar to Jack London's novels. I prefer the writers who wrote, primarily because of the inner need to write, wrote for themselves and let the suitable reader find the book. Henry Miller, Charles Bukowski, even to a certain extent Joseph Conrad. I find this kind of writing a lot more honest, raw and true to the writer's character, the I will build and they will come philosophy. I know this kind of approach doesn't really work in the business world, but we are talking about literature as art, not a money-making enterprise. What is Great Expectations about? It is about growing up, being molded by the environment and personal circumstances, and taking advantage of the opportunities presented to us, many of them short-term blessings and long-term curses. Fortunes and misfortunes and how they are interchangeable. Suffering has been stronger than all other teaching and has taught me to understand what your heart used to be. I have been bent and broken, but I hope into a better shape. Further, it is about choices and decisions we make, how a singular, seemingly incidental event changes our course and the rest of our lives. That was a memorable day to me, for it made great changes in me. But it is the same with any life. Imagine one selected day struck out of it, and think how different its course would have been. The story is also about first love, since it is an important part of growing up. First love, often unreturned, and because of it painful and even tragic, and it influences how we see and behave in all the intimate relationships that come after. Love her, love her, love her. If she favors you, love her. If she wounds you, love her. If she tears your heart to pieces, and as it gets older and stronger, it will tear deeper, love her, love her, love her. But to me, the most important theme of Great Expectations is relationships in general, not only intimate but also friendships, familiar and between casual acquaintances, and all the feelings that are part of them, love, hate, compassion, empathy, indifference, and a few more. A bit of the plot. First, the few characters central to the story. The main character is Pip, an orphan who narrates his life from early childhood to adulthood. Joe, Pip's sister's husband, Miss Havisham, a rich, man-hating old bride who was left by the groom on her wedding day, Miss Havisham's adopted daughter and Pip's love interest, Estella, Abel Megwit, an escaped convict, and Mr. Jaggers, a London attorney who is an agent of Pip's benefactor. And also Biddy, the girl who takes place of his sister, who is also the Pip's chance to change the trajectory of his life. There are many more characters, but I think the previously mentioned ones are the most important to the theme of the story. The story begins in a small-town cemetery somewhere outside of London, where Pip, who is visiting the graves of his parents, is taken hostage by an escaped prisoner, Abel Megwit. In exchange for his freedom, he agrees and does supply the man with food and tools, which he steals from the house he lives in with his short-tempered sister and her good-hearted husband Joe. Sometimes later, Pip becomes employed by Miss Havisham as a playmate and a somewhat practiced target for Estella. During that time, Pip is challenged to a fight by another young contender for Estella's favors, which he wins, and as the reward receives his first kiss. With time, as Pip grows and becomes an apprenticeship to Joe, he stops his regular visits to Miss Havisham. Meanwhile, his sister is attacked and suffers a permanent head injury. The crime's positive effect is that she becomes less physical and more compassionate. When Pip becomes a young man, he is visited by Mr. Jaggers, a London lawyer, who informs him that he has been contracted by an anonymous benefactor as the executor of his will and Pip's financial agent. As the result of the meeting, Pip moves to London and starts his education to become an English gentleman, all the while believing his silent benefactor is Miss Havisham, and the object of the preparations is to make him equal and worthy of Estella. In London, Pip makes friends and enemies and tries his best to cut himself from his humble roots and people connected to them. There was a long hard time when I kept far from me the remembrance of what I had thrown away, when I was quite ignorant of its worth. And eventually his benefactor is unmasked, and this information, not so much the knowledge of it, but the fact of it, is what completely changes his expectations and subsequently the course of his life. Well, the original course of Pip's life was based on his imagination, so he basically goes from dreaming to reality. And perhaps this is the point when one becomes an adult. Take nothing on its looks, take everything on evidence. There is no better rule. I must be taken as I have been made. The success is not mine, the failure is not mine, but the two together make me. And that's the basic plot. What are my thoughts about Great Expectations? It is typical Dickens, even typical Victorian novel, but for me it is the best he wrote. It is one of his last novels, and his literary maturity has reached its pinnacle, and this comes through in the novel. The somber 19th century England portrayed through Pip's childhood is what most children experienced up to the 20th century. The high mortality rates, especially in children, with half of infants dying before reaching their 5th birthday, left Pip an orphan with no memory of his parents nor his 5 brothers, and their gravestones are the only reminder that they ever existed. As I never saw my father or my mother, and never saw any likeness of either of them, for their days were long before the days of photographs, my first fancies regarding what they were like were unreasonably derived from their tombstones. This sentence from the beginning of the book lets us know that Pip, from his early days, was conditioned to depend on his imagination, not to trust what he saw, but what he thought he saw, or how he interpreted. And this is somewhat important since it shaped his conclusions about events he experienced and general view of life. In the 1998 adaptation, my favorite, the scriptwriters take a different approach to make the same point. In the opening scene, Pip says he will not tell the story how it happened, but how he remembers it happened. Perhaps Dickens thought it is important to remember that one's life is not some kind of absolute event, but an interpretation, a self-created illusion. Pip, some people debate whether he is likable or not, but this is subjective and not really important. Pip's purpose is to be the materialization of the novel's focus, which is growing up. His young life is based on dreams, hopes, and expectations. This gives a double meaning to the title. On one hand, great expectations as something tangible, material inheritance which Pip receives, and on the other hand, great expectations as intangible, hopeful expectations we have for our lives. Pip and his growing experience is somewhat of a contrast to Estella's spontaneous and living versus robotic and going through the motions. Estella might also represent Dickens' England of the 19th century, which, because of the Industrial Revolution, became something resembling a machine, mechanical and lacking feelings, but I think this theme is more directly explored in Dickens' other novels. Estella, who is Miss Havisham's tool of revenge and was adapted for this purpose, is an example of how a young child can be molded into anything by an adult, at least until the child psychologically becomes adult herself. But some damage probably cannot be undone and stays for life. Estella is probably the biggest victim of the story because she has no control over who she is and is becoming. She is an exclusive creation of Miss Havisham. Miss Havisham is the most complex, psychologically deep, and sinister character of the novel. She is an example of how destructive for yourself and the ones close to you the want of revenge can be, especially misplaced revenge applied to the innocent instead of the perpetrator. I think I would find the story more interesting if she was the protagonist portrayed in a kind of Joseph Conrad style, but maybe she would be too visible and predictable for Conrad, who preferred the dark side of people, well hidden and less obvious in their behavior. Joe and or versus the sister shows that some people, Joe, will treat you, regardless of the circumstances, nicely, and others, the sister, in spite of implied deeper ties, close family, will not be so nice. Basically, often strangers will show you more kindness than the people who are closely related to you by blood. Maybe because there is no pressure, no obligation, and no resulting bitterness, in contrast to the relations who are supposed to like you. The sister, who is somewhat ambitious, resents having been left by the rest of the family who died to take care of Pip, and she feels it hampered her own life plans and takes it out on the little Pip. She softens her behavior after suffering trauma from the blow on the head, but it is more toward Joe, who she treated as bad as Pip. Joe is a good old chap, in general being satisfied and even happy with what life has given him, and he sees people by default as good. The sister and Joe embody the clash between having expectations for something better and accepting one's life as it is, having no expectations. Mr. Jaggers, the lawyer, represents justice, men's and divine, blind and impartial. He is portrayed as an honest man, doesn't want to know about any illegal activities. He's even somewhat of a genie, popping out of nowhere to make all Pip's wishes come true, but often our wishes, when realized, are not what we expected. The book uses love to make its point about life and relationships. Mr. Jaggers, the lawyer, represents justice, men's and divine, blind and impartial. He's portrayed as an honest man, doesn't want to know about any illegal activities. He's even somewhat of a genie, popping out of nowhere to make all Pip's wishes come true. But often our wishes, when realized, are not what we expected. The book uses love to make its point about life and relationships. I loved her against reason, against promise, against peace, against hope, against happiness, against all discouragement that could be. Love with all the suffering, sacrifices, and anguish that comes with it. There is also some good in it, but this is not part of this novel. Rather, it is about obsessive, hurtful, and unreasonable love. Perhaps how much we are willing to take and how far we can go is a measurement of the depth of our feeling. We reject the good to get more bad, and maybe this kind of behavior and reactions is not love, but rather a learning experience. And this links to the book's theme of growing up, which comes about through experiences and acquiring knowledge. Love might be nothing more than what we believe it is, different depending on the person, his or her experiences, and the opinions he forms. "I'll tell you," said she in the same hurried, passionate whisper, "what real love is. It is blind devotion, unquestioning self-humiliation, other submission, trust and belief against yourself and against the whole world, giving up your whole heart and soul to the smithers, as I did." Maybe how we feel about others is irrational because it is related to how we feel about ourselves, and it changes in the relation to how we change. And finally, Pip understands it because he becomes more mature and wiser, a different man, and there is no going back. We change again and yet again, and it was now too late and too far to go back, and I went on. To sum it up, Great Expectations might be a good read for young people starting out in life and needing a bit of education through a moral tale. As I mentioned before, I'm not a fan of Dickens nor Victorian literature, and I find his writings a bit simplistic and the characters not deep enough. Perhaps this is to be expected from a Victorian Englishman. To be fair, the English writers, have gotten much better in the 20th century. But for me, the 19th century literary belongs to the French and the Russians. It might also be my age. I think I enjoyed Dickens a bit more when I was younger and seeing the world through a simpler lens. I remember watching the 1998 adaptation in the cinema when I was living in Miami Beach, and I thought I could relate to it. Being in love, at least thinking we are, and crazy things we do for it. A couple of years later, somewhat spontaneously, and also being under the influence of this kind of romantic tales, I went to Brazil and started to live a more unconventional life. Now I am much older, experienced, and cynical, and find all of it somewhat childish and amusing. Maybe that's the price we pay for living and having too many adventures. The story also might have too many sub-themes, and the characters, I understand they all somewhat interlink to create the novel, but it seems because of the number of them they are somewhat shallowly explored and just don't go deep enough for me. There are quite a few adaptations of Great Expectations, the famous 1946 classic, which was fine, just like the 2012 version, but I found the 1998 adaptation, which is a modern twist on the novel, to be even better than the book itself. It cut a lot of the novel's fat, but still it transmitted its message. It also had a pretty good acting, thanks to casting some very good actors: Ethan Hawke, Gwyneth Paltrow, Robert De Niro, and Anne Bancroft, and it also included pretty good music. Okay, let's talk about the physical book. The book I am holding is a softcover, which I transformed into hardcover leather-bound edition. To make the cover, I use grade A, naturally tan hide I buy from a tanner in North Spain. It is the same leather Louis Vuitton uses to make his bags, so it is top quality. I do all the processing of the leather myself. First, I designed the cover, which what I did here. I adapted this painting of an early morning in the 19th century London. It is foggy and misty, just like the book often mentions mist when describing the scenery. There is a travel carriage bringing passengers from somewhere in England, similar to the way Pip arrived in London. This is the back with the blurb, and inside the front cover I printed a quote from the book. If you want to see a more detailed video where I explain how I transform paperback into leather-bound hardcover, click on the link in the description. I will make maximum of 100 editions of each title. Each one will be numbered and initialed, and the numbers will go in chronological order from 2 up, since number 1 stays with me. The price will be around $100, so if you would like me to make one for you, you can click below on my email and send me a message. I do not guarantee I will do it, since it will depend on the time I have available, access to leather, and if I can get my hands on the copy of the book. Now, if you're not willing to spend the $100, but you still want the book, what you can do is click below on the PayPal link and donate $3 or more to my channel, and for every 100 donations, I will make a lottery and draw one name, and the winner will receive the book. So if you are cheap but feel lucky, this might be the way to do it. Also, your donations give me the extra motivation to make the book reviews, and I appreciate them very much, so thank you in advance. One more thing, when you make your donation, remember to include the title of the book you would like to win. The book itself is beautiful. Visually, it has a very nice texture, it smells great, and the more you handle it, the more beautiful it will become. And it makes a great gift for yourself or somebody who appreciates books. So if you want one, don't snooze or you might lose. Well, that's it, so let's end it here, and until next time, keep your ear close to the ground and read a book. Adios.